This lecture concerns conservative humanism as a philosophy of education. We will explore the philosophy of education within the conservative humanist tradition, and our representatives of this tradition are Michael Oakeshott, C.S. Lewis, and Dorothy Sayers. To begin, we begin with Oakeshott's reading of conservative humanism, in particular the main idea of purpose in the conservative humanist philosophy as put forth by Oakeshott. Oakeshott conceives the purpose of education as initiation into the world of human achievement. That is the core purpose of an education, is to be initiated into the world of human achievement. He argues that every human being is born an heir to an inheritance, and that inheritance can only be accessed and acquired through a process of learning. This inheritance is the inheritance of human achievement, which constitutes a world, a cultural world of beliefs, facts, understandings, expressions, and meanings, all of which are expressions of the human mind. And being expressions of the human mind, they can only be entered into via a process of learning. Oakeshott maintains that teaching and learning always relate to a historic inheritance of human achievement, and it is that human achievement that is to be handed on, transmitted to, learned, known, and understood by the student as various expressions of human thought. It is the business of the teacher, the purpose of the teacher, and the purpose of education to initiate students into this world of achievement. Teaching is a deliberate, intentional initiation of a pupil into the world of human achievement, or into some part of it. From the perspective of oneself, of self-identity, in conservative humanism, identity is conceived as being formed or constructed in relationship to the culture. That is, identity is dialogically constructed in conversation with the cultural heritage, with the world of human achievement. That is, the pupil, the student, is to be taught in a way that he or she recognizes himself or herself in the mirror of human achievements. That is, our culture, our cultural inheritance, is the source of our identity, our self-identity. Therefore, identity from this perspective is culturally constructed. That is, we do not choose per se our identity, we form our identity in dialogical relation to the culture. Nor is our identity liberated somehow in innate form that's liberated. From conservative humanism, from the perspective of conservative humanism, identity is constructed. Not only is identity constructed, for Oakeshott, ability is constructed through knowledge. He argues that all we know constitutes different abilities. Different amounts of knowledge constitute different degrees of ability or powers. That is, again, our ability to learn, to know, to understand, to think, is not, there might be some innate potential there, but it really, the ability to do that, to exercise those powers, is contingent upon knowing. It's contingent upon the acquisition of knowledge. Thus he writes, all we can be said to know constitutes a manifold of different abilities, different amounts of knowledge being represented in different degrees of ability, and every complex ability being a manifold of similar abilities. He writes, in short, in every ability there is an ingredient of knowledge which cannot be resolved into information, and in some skills this may be the greater part of the knowledge required for their practice. Knowledge is to be recognized as manifolds of abilities, in each of which there is the synthesis of information and judgment. Here, Oakeshott is pointing to the two components of knowledge, information and judgment. And information and judgment, therefore, are always a part of initiating the student into the world of human achievement and creating ability, manifolds of ability through knowledge. So these two components, information and judgment, interact with each other to form knowledge and thereby to form ability. Information is itemized, it's impersonal, it's accepted on authority, it has to do with facts, not opinions, it's stated in propositions, it can be forgotten, it needs to be recollected, it appears in rules to be followed, there are criteria of correctness, etc. So information is factual. Judgment, on the other hand, has to do with principles and understanding. Principles are understood here as underlying rationales for things, how things work, why they work in a certain way. And this leads to the capacity for understanding and explanation. Principles are the means of understanding and explanation. And judgment has to do with not knowing what, as information does, but judgment has to do with knowing how. The ability to do, to make, to understand, to explain, to interpret, to determine relevance, to apply, to choose, to think, to analyze, to synthesize. All the cognitive processes of thinking pertain to judgment. And we think in terms of frameworks of principles. Human beings require principles in order to think. And that is the nature of judgment, which is distinct from information, which is about facts, about knowing what. Judgment is about knowing how to think. So education from this perspective is an integration of knowing what to think and how to think. It's very important to emphasize that in conservative humanism, both identity and ability are constructed out of the cultural inheritance. They're not liberated as such. Recall that in liberal humanism, we have the idea that human potential is liberated, unfolded through exposure to the greatest thoughts of human achievement, and also the processes of inquiry and experience. participation, of dialogue, of inquiry, questioning, etc. Liberal humanism argues that the purpose of education is the liberation of the mind. Conservative humanism is here arguing that the purpose of education is really the construction of the mind, the construction of identity, and the construction of ability through the acquisition of cultural knowledge, the acquisition of the being initiated into the inheritance of human achievement. Therefore, the conservation of the cultural inheritance is of primary importance to the education of the person in terms of both identity and ability. That is, educations should conserve the inheritance. And by conserving the inheritance, ability and identity are constructed, and human well-being is constructed. Therefore, the inheritance of human achievement, the cultural inheritance, the world of human achievement as expressed in thought, forms the curriculum. In terms of pedagogy, we have in conservative humanism, we have an integration of judgment and learning. There are things that must be learned, that is acquired and transmitted to the student, that is information. And that's a part of our inheritance learned as a byproduct of acquiring information. But knowledge also requires judgment, being able to think with an appreciation of the considerations which belong to different modes of thought. And judgment, as learning how to think rather than what to think, is an ability. And the student learns this ability, acquires this ability by listening, by recognizing them in the conduct and utterances of others. Thus, teaching judgment is imparting. Oakeshott concludes that the real substance of our inheritance is contained in the manner in which information is conveyed. That is, how we learn to think is by observing the thinking processes of others, in particular our teachers, who have a more sophisticated and developed ability to think. They know how to think, or should know how to think. And it's by being exposed to their thinking processes, that is their manner of thinking, and the manner of expression of their thoughts, is how judgment is acquired. Turning to C.S. Lewis' piece on reading old books. Oakeshott made the point that what is to be taken to be our current inheritance often neglects and or forgets past achievements. That is, there's a tendency to overlook the past and be narrowly focused on the present, on what is current, rather than necessarily what is the best. And that Lewis remarks that every age has its own outlook. But if we just stick to our own outlook, the argument goes, we will receive a very narrow inheritance. Lewis is suggesting, consistent with Oakeshott and conservative humanism, that we broaden the inheritance, that we release students from the servitude of current belief systems and ways of thought. We open and expand the perspective. And how we open and expand the perspective is by exposing them to old books. As Lewis metaphorically states, we need to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. So our intellectual and cultural heritage is not confined to the present expression of human achievement, but goes back, and that education should expose us not only to what is current, but what our long history is of thought, and the best thoughts, the best ideas, and the best of human achievement throughout the history of our culture, thereby broadening the perspective, broadening the inheritance. Dorothy Sayers, in keeping with Oakeshot's emphasis not only on what to know, what we should know, but also on how to think, not only on what to think, but how to think. Dorothy Sayers argues that a fundamental core part of our cultural heritage are the tools of learning, what she calls the tools of learning. And she argues that we have lost those tools of learning in our current educational system. And we are focused more on what to think rather than how to think as the main purpose of education. And thereby we have only half, or perhaps less, of our cultural inheritance. The curriculum from the perspective of the tools of learning, therefore, is comprised for Dorothy Sayers of three fundamental tools of learning, which she calls grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. The first step in learning the tools, or acquiring the tools of learning, is to learn the structure of language. That is, the logic of language, and the logic of the language of the disciplines of knowledge, which she calls grammar. The second tool is dialectic. That is, we need to embrace logic and disputation. That is, we need to think logically, learn to think logically and analytically, to analyze, evaluate, assess, argue for, support, through logic, our ideas and the ideas of others. And thirdly, the third tool is rhetoric. Rhetoric being the art and skill of persuasion, or more precisely, the art and skill of articulate expression, that we need to be able to express our ideas, our opinions, as clearly and as forcefully as possible, and that is a skill which needs to be learned. We have lost these tools of learning, according to Sayers. We are focused on teaching subjects rather than on the method of thinking, arguing, and expressing. And therefore we have lost a part of our intellectual heritage. And this intellectual heritage must be recovered in order for authentic education to occur. In more detail, grammar She argues we should all learn Latin. Whether that is feasible or attractive is an open question. But she advocates Latin because um, through the study of Latin, we students will learn the structure of language. More broadly, use the idea of grammar as the logic, the disciplinary logic of knowledge. That is, each discipline of knowledge is structured by its own logic. History has its own logic. Philosophy has its own logical structure. Geography, science, mathematics. That is, the logic of a discipline defines the logical structure of the discipline defines that discipline as unique, as different. And the logical structure of the discipline includes such things as what questions are to be answered, what standards of justification are valid, what methods of inquiry are valid, given the questions of the discipline, what counts as valid knowledge. That is, what are the criteria or standards through which we know something to be valid, true, reliable, etc. So each discipline of knowledge has its own grammar, if you will, its own logical structure. And a part of being educated is to learn various structures of knowledge, the logical structures of different disciplines of knowledge. And through understanding the structure of the logic of a discipline, the student learns how to think as a member of that discipline. And one becomes initiated as a member of a discipline by acquiring the way of thinking of that discipline. So one learns how to think like a historian. One learns how to think like a physicist. One learns how to think like a mathematician. One learns how to think like a philosopher. One learns how to think like a poet, like an artist, etc. And by being exposed to the grammar of these disciplines, the way of thinking of these disciplines, one broadens one's capacity to think. We're not educated narrowly to think in one way. In this perspective, we're educated to think in multiple ways, from multiple perspectives, based upon multiple logical structures or grammars. And this is a way of learning how to think. One learns how to think from this perspective by understanding how others have thought. And again, here we have the inheritance of ways of thinking through exposure to the grammar, the logical structure of various disciplines. Secondly, the second tool is dialectic, the faculty of discursive reason. Here the emphasis is on the logic of argument, constructing logical arguments, constructing meaningful questions, being able to ask the right question, being able to formulate logically supportive arguments for one's opinions, including both one's own positions as well as logical support for one's evaluation or assessment of the opinions of others. Dialectic, therefore, is about the ability to think analytically and synthetically, to think logically, and to use logic to provide reasons for one's point of view. It is the skill of discursive reasoning. And notice here that the grammar or logical structure of a discipline is interrelated with the capacity to think logically, to analyze, to exercise discursive reason. They're not separate. While they're interrelated tools. Thirdly, the third skill is rhetoric. That is the skill of presentation, the skill of articulation, of the skill of presenting clearly one's position, one's arguments, in a way that is both understandable and persuasive to the audience. She argues that we should include, perhaps in high school, or at least at the college level, the old practice of the public defense of a thesis, which we have usually now at the doctoral level. More broadly, rhetoric can be incorporated into all classes. We should perhaps ask our students from this perspective, not only to think, not only to acquire knowledge and information, not only to learn how to think logically and analytically, but thirdly, also to learn how to express and articulate one's ideas. And these tools, Sayers argues, these tools of learning are the same in any and every subject. That is, the tools of learning are pervasive in all subject matters and can be applied in all subject matters. They are, for Sayers and the conservative humanists, universal tools, universal skills of thought. And they should be acquired in education. Sayers concludes that we have lost the tools of learning, the axe and the wedge, the hammer and the saw, and chisel and the plane, that were so adaptable to all tasks. Instead of them, we have merely a set of complicated jigs, each of which will do what one task and no more, and in using which eye in hand receive no training, so that no man ever sees the work as a whole or looks to the end of the work. That is, by not teaching the tools of learning, we have lost a fundamental part of our heritage, our cultural heritage, and the world of achievement, and thereby have been diminished as both individuals and as a civilization.